certificate, for example, is purposely left blank, but only for people ranging from light to dark brown skin complexions. In part one of the segment, I shared congressional records uncommonly known by the public that details the truth about census records and why the choice of your family's classification of race was solely up to the individual census taker of that particular area and not your family members. The complexity of census records is in fact outrageously discombobulating, but still very utilitarian for research purposes and enthralling nonetheless. During the early half of the year 1790, Congress assigned full responsibility of census taking to the marshals of the U.S. judicial districts under an act that governs census taking through the years 1790 to 1840. It was then called the 1790 Census Act, having been signed by then-President George Washington, Vice President John Adams, and the Speaker of the House, Frederick Muhlenberg, on March 1st, 1790. During this time period, there were many open political debates about who should be counted, and they also struggled with the idea of allowing indentured servants to be counted equally as the same as free whites. There was an economic structure already in place to this entire governmental construct that was not limited to taxation only, which sparked the debate with Northerners wanting slaves or indentured servants to be counted as equivalent of free whites, as the Southerners did not. Eventually, there was a compromise established, and August 2nd, 1790 marked the date of the official census day. According to the Census Bureau, the 1790 law required that, quote, every household be visited, that completed census schedules be posted in two of the most public places within each jurisdiction, there to remain for the inspection of all concerned, and that the aggregate amount of each description of persons for every district be transmitted to the president. Census enumerators were required to record a total of 6 inquiries in the 1790 census, calling for the names of the heads of each household and the number of persons in each household of the following descriptions: free white males 16 years and older, free white males under 16 years old, free white females, all other free, and slaves. The marshals or census enumerators were instructed to identify free white males by age brackets. It was noted that this tactic was designed to determine the country's industrial and military capabilities, and whoever refused to answer the the enumerators' questions, were assessed a hefty fine of $25 at that time. Under the general direction of the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, the marshals took the census in the original 13 states, plus the districts of Kentucky, Maine, Vermont, and Tennessee. Both George Washington and Thomas Jefferson expressed skepticism over the final count, expecting a number that exceeded the 3.9 million inhabitants counted during the close of the 1790 census. So I must ask, what number did George Washington and Thomas Jefferson expect to see at the end of taking the 1790 census? Leave your comments down below and tell me what you think. And what is also important to note here is that there were various census instructions given to the census takers concerning Indians during the early 1790s and even throughout the 1800s that I want to go over with you. Starting in the 1790s, census takers were notified of instructional specifications stating, quote, omitting Indians not taxed, distinguishing free persons, including those bound to service, from all others. During the year 1800, these instructions were slightly adjusted, stating that Indians living off of reservations and not wild should be recorded in the All Other Free Persons column of the census form. The 1800 census classification options were free white, slave, and all other free persons. So we can easily determine that they have added the word persons to the already established category, all other free, which was used in the 1790 census 10 years prior. Interesting enough, the Indians living in the wild, generally meaning plains, and the Indians in the West, or on reservations, were not taxed. But those who were enumerated were recorded in the All Other Free column in the 1790 census. Once the Constitution called for a census of all persons excluding Indians not taxed, many other adjustments were made towards the classifications taken by the enumerators, mainly due to the sole purpose of apportioning seats in the House of Representatives and assessing direct federal taxes. On March 2nd, 1807, then-President Thomas Jefferson signed an act to prohibit the importation of slaves into any port or place with the jurisdiction of the United States. This act deemed it unlawful to, quote, import or bring into the United States or the territories thereof from any foreign kingdom, place, or country any Negro, mulatto, or person of color with intent to hold, sell, or dispose of such Negro, mulatto, or person of color as a slave, or to be held to service or labor, end quote. This act came into effect as of January 1st, 1808. Keep that in mind. These familiar terms that I just mentioned, like Negro, mulatto, and person of color, were not used as the official classifications of race on the census during this time period of 1808. In fact, just 2 years later, in 1810, there were very few adjustments made to this third census, making Indians living off of reservations now recorded in the All Others column of the census form. This time around, the options were free white, slave, and all other, in replacement for the 1790 and 1800 census option that read all other free and all other free persons. Soon after that, the War of 1812 made American history. It was a war declared by then-President James Madison because of the discovery of Great Britain supporting many Indians with rebelling against white settlers squatting in America. This war between the United States and Great Britain lasted until the year 1815, and then 5 years later, the 1820 census made some critical adjustments to the classifications of race on their forms. This time, the Indians that were living off of reservations were recorded in the free colored persons category. Note that this is the very first time ever in history where the census utilizes the term colored. And other options included on the form were free whites, slaves, and then all others, except Indians not taxed. So, generally speaking, the phrase Indians not taxed is referring to the Indians living on reservations under the aid and care of government agencies or roaming individuals or in bands over settled tracts of the country. But need I remind you that according to the 1828 Webster's English Language Dictionary, which was 8 years after this census, the noun American is defined as a native of America, originally applied to the Aboriginals, or copper-colored races, found here by the Europeans, but now applied to the descendants of Europeans born in America. Then, the very next year, on March 4th, 1829, Andrew Jackson began his presidency in the White House. Then on February 22nd, 1830, Senator Hugh White proposed a bill from the Committee on Indian Affairs called the Indian Removal Act. According to the Library of Congress, the Indian Removal Act was signed into law by then President Andrew Jackson on May 28, 1830, authorizing the president to grant unsettled lands west of the Mississippi River in exchange for Indian lands within existing state borders. A few tribes were said to have left peacefully, but millions resisted the relocation policy and stayed put throughout the southern lands of America. By the 1850 census, 20 years later, another change took place, whereas the categories for race were now white, black, and mulatto. What is very important to note is that if a person looked light or mid to dark brown skin in complexion and was an Indian, the census takers recorded them as M for mulatto. According to the 1828 Webster's English Language Dictionary, mulatto is defined as, quote, a person that is the offspring of a negress by a white man or of a white woman by a Negro, end quote. According to the 8th edition of the Collins Spanish Language Dictionary, the term negress is defined as an offensive word describing a woman or girl of color, or negra, or negra, or negra.
I think most people think the census is about counting, and that's what I thought. It's really an exercise in counting before I started to do research. And I started to look back since 1790 of how we counted Americans along racial and ethnic lines. And back then it was color, and there was a controversy then, who should be counted? And should slaves who are black be counted the same as free whites? And because there's money involved and taxation involved, there was a big debate. The Northerners wanted slaves to be counted as the equivalent of free whites, and the Southerners didn't, and they agreed on a compromise that black slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a white person. So in that sense, the census not only cemented the color line, but reinforced how we thought of race, racial inequalities. And these categories have constantly changed, which is really fascinating. I was saying backstage that in 1850, we had a category mulatto to try to capture the amount of racial mixing. In 1850, we had a category mulatto to try to capture the amount of racial mixing.
But how can you capture racial mixing in 1850 when blood testing was invented during the early 1930s?
Between blacks and whites. In 1890, I believe, they added octoroon and quadroon to try to get at precise racial mixtures between blacks and whites. And then in 1930, because there was so much racial mixing, they actually dropped that altogether and just used black for anyone with any trace of black ancestry. And hence this idea of the one-drop rule.
So why is it a one-drop rule instead of being an actual proven fact?
Which has stayed so pervasive in the minds of Americans of